The desert was bleeding red. Evening light poured across the Arizona plains, sharp and fiery, turning dust into drifting embers. The wind carried grit that bit into skin, whispering through the dry bones of mesquite trees and across a sagging fence that hadn't been straight in years. Luke Harrison worked that fence like a man at war with silence. His hands were rough and sunburned, his shirt darkened by sweat. Each nail he drove in felt like a way to keep his world from coming apart. A small, stubborn act against everything time had taken. The land around him stretched wide and empty, the kind of quiet that could swallow a man whole. It suited Luke. Out here, he didn't have to remember the screams from the war or the smell of burning wood from the night his wife died. The desert didn't care who you were. It just demanded you keep standing. Then, it came. Faint at first, buried under the sigh of wind. A sound that didn't belong to coyotes or cattle. A human sound. Luke froze, the hammer hanging in his grip. The wind shifted again, and there it was. A broken cry, soft as breath, carried from somewhere beyond the dry riverbed. He lifted his rifle, instinct taking over, and moved toward it. Boots crunching over gravel, eyes scanning the brush. The sun dipped lower, shadows crawling longer. Every sense sharpened the way they used to on the battlefield. Behind a fallen log, he saw her. She was young, maybe 20. Her skin the color of copper dust, her clothes torn and stained with blood. Her breathing came in shallow tremors, and her right hand twitched toward a small hunting knife lying just beyond her reach. When Luke stepped closer, her dark eyes flicked open. Not fearful, but defiant, like a cornered wolf. "Don't move," he said softly, lowering the rifle barrel toward the sand. Her lips trembled. Then she spoke, the words thin as the wind. "Please, just make it fast." Luke didn't move. For a long, dry moment, even the wind seemed to stop. She thought he was another white man come to finish what others started. He'd heard that tone before. The voice of someone who'd already buried their hope. He shook his head. "No," he said quietly, his voice rasped from dust and years of silence. "No one dies on my land without a fight." Her eyes flickered, confusion replacing defiance for a heartbeat. But then her body sagged again, too weak to resist. Luke knelt beside her, tearing a strip from his shirt. The wound on her side was bad. Deep, dark, maybe from a blade. He pressed the cloth down, steady, firm. She hissed through her teeth but didn't pull away. "Hold still," he muttered. She whispered something in Apache, the words soft, like a prayer. He didn't understand, but it sounded like goodbye. Luke ignored it. He slid his arms beneath her. She was lighter than a sack of feed, trembling against his chest. "Easy," he murmured. "You're not dying out here." He carried her to his horse, set her gently across the saddle, then swung up behind her. The sky had turned violet now, streaked with the last gold of the sun. Wind tore through the silence as the horse started forward, hooves striking the hardpan. The miles home felt endless. Coyotes cried somewhere out in the dark. A storm was brewing. He could smell rain and electricity on the air. The girl stirred once, her head pressing weakly against his shoulder, whispering words too faint to catch. "Save your strength," he said. "We're close." By the time he reached the cabin, night had settled deep. The first drops of rain spattered the porch as he pushed the door open with his boot. The old hinges groaned. Inside, the air was thick with wood smoke and loneliness. He laid her on his bed, lit the oil lamp, and grabbed the basin from the shelf. Under the flicker of the lantern, her face came into focus. High cheekbones, streaks of dirt, blood dried like paint. She looked proud, even half dead. Luke poured water into the bowl, the sound sharp in the silence. He cleaned the wound as best he could, working slow, careful. The smell of iron filled the air. She winced but never cried out. "You've got grit," he said quietly. "That's good." When he finished, he wrapped a clean cloth around her waist. Then he sat back, studying her in the dim light. Her chest rose and fell shallowly, but steady now. Outside, the rain began to fall harder, drumming against the roof. Luke leaned forward, adjusting the lamp wick until its flame softened. He watched her for a long time. There were stories written all over her skin. Scars, dust, and silence. She wasn't just hurt, she'd been hunted. He stood, walked to the hearth, and threw on another log. Sparks leapt upward, catching the low rafters in an amber glow. When he turned back, she was half awake, her gaze fixed on him. "You're a rancher," she whispered, voice trembling. "White man. You see Apache? You shoot." Luke paused, his shadow stretching across the floor. "Not tonight," he said. Her eyes searched his face, looking for a lie. When she didn't find one, her lids fluttered closed. Luke exhaled slowly, the tension draining from his shoulders. He sat down beside the fire, the rifle resting across his knees. He hadn't meant to bring anyone into his world again, not since the day he buried his wife. But something about that girl, the way she looked at him without begging, without fear, cut through the walls he'd built. Thunder rolled far off across the plains. He looked toward the door, the desert beyond, hidden by the storm. He knew what this meant. Trouble always followed good intentions in a land this cruel. Still, when he turned back and saw her breathing steady, he felt something he hadn't felt in years: purpose. He rubbed his hands together by the fire, watching the rain slide down the window like ghosts of the past washing away. The girl murmured something again in her language, soft, rhythmic, like wind through pine. Then silence returned, deep and fragile. Luke leaned back in his chair, the firelight drawing tired lines across his face. He whispered to himself, almost afraid to believe it, "She'll make it through the night." Outside, lightning tore the horizon apart, and for a moment the world was bright. The land, the cabin, and the man inside who had just chosen mercy over memory. And as the storm raged on, Luke Harrison, small rancher, widower, and man of too many ghosts, sat in that wooden room listening to the heartbeat of someone the world had already given up on. He didn't know her name, but he knew this: no one would die on his land tonight. Morning came slow across the valley. The storm had rolled out sometime before dawn, leaving behind a silver mist that clung to the edges of the pasture and the soft hiss of water dripping from the eaves. Inside Luke Harrison's cabin, the air smelled of rain-soaked dust and old pine smoke. The fire in the hearth had burned down to coals, glowing faint and red. On the bed, the Apache girl stirred beneath a coarse wool blanket. Her breathing, once ragged, had steadied. Luke sat in the corner chair, hat tilted forward, boots muddy, watching the flames instead of her. He hadn't slept, hadn't dared. He just listened. The crackle of the fire, the faint moan of wind through the chimney, and the girl's quiet murmurs in a language he didn't know. When she moved again, Luke rose and crossed the creaking floorboards. Her eyes opened, dark and sharp now, no longer clouded by fever. She blinked, disoriented, her gaze darting across the room. The first thing she saw was the rifle hanging on the wall. Her body tensed, every muscle coiled to strike, but she was too weak to move. Luke noticed it but said nothing. He poured water from a kettle into a tin cup, then held it out. "Here," he said simply. She hesitated, her expression wary and proud. For a moment she looked at the cup like it might be poisoned. Then slowly she took it, her hand trembling as she brought it to her lips. The silence stretched thin between them. "You're safe here," Luke said, his voice low and steady. "For now." Her eyes flicked up at him. "Why?" she asked, her tone rough but clear. He didn't answer. Instead, he nodded toward the bowl on the small table. "Eat something. You'll need it." It wasn't kindness he was trying to show. At least that's what he told himself. It was just decency, just something a man ought to do. But when he turned to leave, she said softly, "You could have left me." He stopped, one hand on the doorframe. The light from the window fell across his face, catching the lines carved deep by sun and time. "I could have," he said. Then after a long pause, without turning back, "But someone once left me too." And with that, he stepped outside into the cold light of morning. Days passed like that. Luke rose before dawn, fed the horses, fixed the fence, and worked the land like it owed him something. He said little. The girl, Naya, as he'd later learn, stayed inside most of the time, quiet as a ghost. Sometimes she watched him from the small window, a rough hand wiping sweat from his brow, the way he talked to his horse under his breath, or how he stopped by the riverbed each afternoon, staring off toward the mountains as if waiting for someone who'd never come. At night, she listened to the rhythm of his footsteps on the porch, the squeak of the rocking chair, and the occasional sound of him humming. Low, slow, tuneless. The first words she spoke to him after that morning came 3 days later. She had managed to get out of bed, unsteady but determined. Luke found her by the corral, holding onto the post for balance, watching the horses with a kind of reverence. "You shouldn't be up," he said, pulling off his gloves. "I don't want to lie in that bed anymore," she replied, voice hoarse but firm. "Feels like waiting for death." Luke half smiled, the first time his face softened since she'd arrived. "You're not dying," he said. "I was," she muttered, still looking at the horses. He shrugged. "Not anymore." A silence hung, heavier than before, but warmer somehow. When he offered his hand to help her back inside, she looked at it for a long second, like touching him might break some rule of her world. But finally she took it. As the days grew longer, she began to move around the cabin more. She patched the tear in one of his shirts, swept the floor, and fed the stray cat that came each evening for scraps. Luke didn't stop her. He just watched, quietly grateful but unsure how to show it. One night he came in from the barn, soaked in dust and sweat, to find her sitting near the firelight, mending one of his old coats. The soft glow danced over her face, strong lines, eyes deep like the desert sky before rain. "You don't have to do that," he said, setting his hat down. "I know," she replied without looking up, "but you fix fences all day. Somebody's got to fix something else." He leaned against the wall, studying her. The way she handled the needle with calm precision, the way her braid rested over her shoulder. "Where'd you learn to sew like that?" he asked. "My mother," she said, "before the soldiers came." Luke's chest tightened. He wanted to ask more, but the look in her eyes stopped him. That flicker of memory no words could touch. By the time the moon turned full again, things had begun to settle into a quiet rhythm. Luke worked. Naya helped. And the house, once filled with only the creak of wood and wind, began to sound like life again. The clatter of dishes, the soft rustle of cloth, the faint hum of a woman's voice as she worked. But outside those walls, the world had already started talking. When Luke rode into town for feed and supplies, the whispers followed him like dust devils. "Did you hear? Harrison's got an Indian up there. An Apache girl, they say. He's out of his mind. You can't trust them." Luke ignored them, jaw set, eyes cold. He took what he needed, paid in cash, and left before the talk turned ugly. Back at the ranch, Naya asked, "You went into town?" He nodded. "They say things," she said quietly, watching his face. "They always do," he answered. "Talk's free." She hesitated. "You don't have to risk that. I can go." He shook his head. "Not yet. You ain't ready for that kind of hate." Her lips pressed together, hurt but understanding. That night after supper, she sat by the fire again, staring into the flames. The silence between them had changed. No longer sharp and defensive, but curious, searching. She asked, "You live here alone?" "Yeah," Luke said, pouring himself a cup of coffee. "How long?" He thought about it. Long enough to forget what it's like not to. She smiled faintly, the first time he'd seen it. "Maybe that's not a bad thing." He glanced over. "Maybe not," he said. But the truth sat heavy in his chest. He wasn't sure he could ever remember what it meant to share a life again. The days that followed were quieter still. One morning, Naya took the bucket and fetched water from the creek. When she came back, Luke was chopping firewood. "You're gonna overdo it," he warned. She smirked, setting the bucket down. "You can't tell a woman who's survived worse not to lift a bucket." Luke chuckled, a sound so foreign it startled them both. It felt good, dangerous but good. He looked up at her then, really looked, at the fire in her eyes, the steadiness in her hands. She wasn't the same broken girl he'd carried from the desert, and something deep inside him, something he'd buried under years of dust and silence, stirred. That night while she slept, he stepped outside and stared at the wide sky. The stars were sharp as nails, the kind that hold the heavens together. He thought of what she'd said. "You could have left me." And for the first time, he wondered if saving her had saved him too. By morning, another rumor had reached the valley, carried by wind and riders and fear. The ranchers hiding an Apache woman. Luke heard it from the blacksmith himself, a man too kind to lie but too afraid to keep secrets. When he returned home, Naya was waiting at the door. Her expression told him she already knew. He handed her the sack of flour, his face unreadable. "They'll come asking," she said. "They can ask," he replied, voice firm. Then after a pause, "but they won't find anything they understand." She met his eyes. For the first time, neither looked away. The fire crackled behind them, throwing their shadows across the wooden walls. Two silhouettes carved from pain, pride, and something beginning to feel like faith. Outside, the wind picked up again, whispering across the desert. It carried words no one would ever speak aloud. Two lost souls bound not by blood or law, but by mercy. And mercy out here was rarer than rain. The morning came dry and sharp, the kind that cut straight through bone. Dust rolled low across the prairie, and the sun climbed behind it, pale and mean. Luke Harrison was out by the corral, tightening a loose rail, when he heard the distant thud of hooves. He stopped mid-swing, hand frozen on the hammer. The sound wasn't just one rider, it was three. He looked up, squinting against the glare. Across the open stretch of land, three men on horseback were cutting through the haze, their silhouettes long and deliberate. Luke's jaw tensed. He didn't need to guess who led them. Blake Turner. He wiped the sweat from his brow, then leaned his hammer against the post. The horsemen slowed as they neared the fence, their horses snorting, kicking up dry clouds that drifted between them like ghosts. Blake was still the same, wide shoulders, arrogant tilt to his chin, a man too proud of the gun at his side. He sat tall on a black mare, boots polished, eyes burning with the kind of certainty only fools carried. "Morning, Harrison," Blake called, voice slick with mockery. "Heard you've gone soft." Luke didn't answer. He just stood there, one hand resting on the fence post. Blake spat into the dirt and smirked. "Word around town says you're keeping one of them in your house. That true?" Luke's eyes didn't flinch. "Turn your horse around, Blake," he said evenly. "You're trespassing." Blake chuckled, low and mean. "I'll take that as a yes." One of the men behind him, a wiry kid with a scar down his cheek, shifted in the saddle. "We saw smoke from your chimney every night this week," he said. "Can't be that lonely, huh?" The third man laughed under his breath. "Guess Harrison's got himself a new kind of housekeeper." Luke's gaze cut through them, steady as a blade. "You boys best mind your tongues." Blake leaned forward, eyes narrowing. "Come on, Luke. You know how this goes. You can't save every stray that crawls out of the desert. That girl's kind. They're trouble. You of all people should remember that." Luke took a slow step closer to the fence. "And you should remember when to shut up." For a second, the wind dropped. The only sound was the creak of leather and the low growl of horses shifting their weight. Then from behind Luke, the cabin door creaked open. Naya stepped out, barefoot in the dust, her hair braided tight, face calm but unyielding. The sun caught her eyes, turning them into obsidian. Blake's grin faltered for a heartbeat before twisting into a sneer. "Well, hell," he said. "Ain't she brave?" Naya didn't move. She stood tall, chin lifted, not a flicker of fear. Blake spat into the dirt again. "You lost your damn mind, Harrison. Bringing one of them into your home. You think the town will just let that slide?" Luke's voice came quiet, steady, carrying more weight than a shout. "You'll leave my land now." Blake's hand dropped toward his holster. Not drawing, just a gesture, a warning. "You threatening me?" Luke didn't blink. "No, I'm telling you." The silence that followed was like gunpowder in the air. Dry, dangerous, one spark away from fire. The men shifted uneasily. Even the horses seemed to sense the line being drawn. Finally, Blake gave a small laugh, bitter and forced. "You always were a fool for lost causes." He turned his horse around slowly, looking back over his shoulder. "This ain't over, Harrison." Luke watched them ride off, the dust swallowing their figures until the horizon took them whole. Only then did he let out a long breath. Naya stood motionless beside the porch steps, watching him. Her voice broke the silence. "They'll come back." He nodded, picking up the hammer from the ground. Probably. Why didn't you tell them I was gone? He met her gaze, the hard truth in his eyes. Because I don't lie. Not even to snakes. That night, the wind turned colder. Luke sat inside by the fire, the orange light flickering over his hands as he cleaned his rifle piece by piece. Metal glinting, wood polished smooth by years of use. Naya sat near the table, mending a torn sleeve. The steady pull of thread, the only sound besides the crackle of the fire. Finally, she spoke. They were soldiers once, weren't they? Luke didn't look up. Some were. Some still think they are. She paused. You knew their leader. Yeah, Luke said quietly. Too well. He set the clean barrel aside, leaning back in the chair. The firelight caught his face, and for the first time, Naya saw the old scars along his jaw, pale reminders of another war. Blake saved my life once, he said, voice low. Back when we both thought the killing meant something. And now? Now he just kills for what's left. Pride, fear, the lie folks tell themselves when the world changes faster than they can hate it. Naya looked down at the fabric in her lap, her fingers frozen mid-stitch. They hate what they don't understand, she whispered. Yeah, he said, and they'll burn it down if they can. Outside, the coyotes called to one another, distant and haunting. Naya set the fabric aside and looked toward him again. If they come back, will you fight them? Luke's hands stilled on the rifle. He didn't answer right away. He could hear the wind howling through the gaps in the shutters, the faint groan of the roof. The desert had a way of reminding men just how small they were. Finally, he said, if I have to. She studied him, the way his shoulders slumped slightly under the weight of words he didn't want to say. You don't want to fight, she said softly. He shook his head. No, but I'm damn good at it. Later that night, when the fire burned low, Luke stepped out onto the porch. The stars stretched endless and sharp above him. His land lay quiet. The fence line, the corral, the old barn leaning slightly under the moonlight. He remembered Blake's voice. You've gone soft, Harrison. Maybe he had. Or maybe softness was just the first sign of a man remembering he still had a heart. Behind him, the door creaked open. Naya stepped out, wrapped in his old coat. They'll come again, she said. People like him don't stop until they get what they want. Luke's eyes stayed on the horizon. Then we'll make sure they don't get it. For a long time, neither spoke. The wind pressed against them, cool and dry. Finally, she said quietly, you could let me go. It'd be easier. Luke turned to her then, the firelight from the window cutting across his face. Weary, weathered, resolute. I've done the easy thing before, he said. Didn't change a damn thing. Naya's eyes softened. She looked out over the desert, where the night stretched forever. Inside, the fire popped and the smell of burnt wood drifted out. The two of them stood there, the rancher and the woman the world refused to see as human, listening to the land breathe. There was a stillness between them, not peaceful, but alive, the kind that came before storms. Luke tightened his coat against the chill. Get some sleep, he said. Tomorrow's going to be long. She hesitated at the doorway, glancing back at him. Good night, Luke. He nodded, eyes fixed on the empty horizon. Good night, Naya. When she closed the door behind her, the ranch fell quiet again. Luke stayed where he was, staring out into the dark. Somewhere out there, he knew, Blake Turner was sharpening his anger, turning rumor into reason. The desert didn't need much to start a war, just a match and a man who thought he was right. Luke rested a hand on the rifle slung over his shoulder, his voice barely a whisper against the wind. Let it come. And from the cabin window behind him, a soft light glowed, the fire still burning, defiant against the night. The storm rolled in like a herd of ghosts. Dark clouds dragged across the desert, low and swollen, swallowing the horizon whole. The wind howled through the valley, slamming against the walls of Luke Harrison's cabin until the wood moaned like a wounded animal. Luke knew this night would come. He'd spent the day readying the ranch, tightening the shutters, driving stakes into the loose boards, checking his rifle twice over. Naya helped without a word, her face pale in the gray light, eyes bright and unflinching. By dusk, the world had turned the color of ash. Lightning flashed in the distance, white veins ripping across a bruised sky. The smell of rain mixed with gun oil and fear. Luke moved from window to window, securing the latch. Naya followed behind, setting oil lamps on the sill, their flicker bending in the drafts. "They'll wait for the storm to hide them," he muttered. Naya didn't ask who they were. She already knew. When the first thunderclap hit, Luke stepped outside to check the barn. Wind ripped his hat clean off, rain slapping hard against his face. He fought his way to the stable, tightening the doors while his horse whinnied inside, restless from the coming chaos. The lightning lit the plains in bursts, empty one second, alive with shadows the next. He could almost see them out there already. Men with rifles, faces hard, hearts small. When he returned to the porch, Naya was standing in the doorway, holding the rifle he'd taught her to use. The lamplight caught the steel of the barrel and the determination in her eyes. "You ready?" he asked. She nodded once. "I was born in storms." He almost smiled. Almost. By the time night swallowed the valley, the rain came in sheets. The roof shook, water dripped from the beams, and the whole cabin seemed to breathe under the weight of wind. Luke set his rifle by the door and lit one more lamp. "If they ride up, stay in the loft," he said. "You'll have the angle." Naya didn't argue. She climbed the ladder, rifle slung across her back, her braid swaying behind her. Luke took position near the front door, shotgun loaded, revolver on his hip. He crouched low, waiting, listening. The wind screamed through the cracks. The rain drummed on the tin roof. Then, under it all, he heard what he'd been waiting for. Hooves. They came slow at first, muffled by the mud, then clearer. A steady rhythm of men who'd ridden too far to turn back. Luke exhaled, steadying his breath. "Showtime," he whispered. Lightning flared outside, and in that blinding flash, he saw them. 5, maybe 6 riders, fanning out near the corral. Blake Turner's voice cut through the storm. "Harrison, you think you can hide behind that door forever?" Luke leaned against the wall, jaw tight. "You boys never could knock polite," Thunder answered. Then the first shot shattered the night. Glass exploded from the front window. The lamp on the sill burst, spilling flame across the curtain. Luke dropped to the floor, rolled, and fired back. One clean shot through the gap. A man outside screamed, his rifle falling into the mud. "Two fewer," Luke muttered. Another bullet tore through the wooden wall, splinters flying across his face. He ducked behind the table, reloaded, and shouted toward the loft. "You got eyes on them?" Naya's voice came back sharp over the storm. "2 by the barn, 1 near the fence." "Take the one near the fence." She didn't hesitate. The gunshot cracked from above, echoing like thunder itself. When the smoke cleared, another shadow dropped. The storm swallowed the sound of dying. Blake's voice rose again, louder this time. "She ain't worth dying for, Luke." Luke leaned out the window and fired 2 quick rounds in reply, both snapping wood inches from Blake's boot. "That's your opinion." Rain poured through the broken window, soaking the floor. The smell of wet earth and gunpowder filled the air. Another volley of shots ripped through the cabin walls, tearing into the furniture. Naya fired again from the loft, reloading with fast, steady hands. When Luke moved to cover her, a bullet grazed his shoulder, spinning him back against the wall. The pain came hot and mean, blood seeping through his shirt. Naya saw it from above and froze. "Luke, I'm fine," he barked, gripping the wound. "Keep shooting." But his hands shook as he reloaded. He could feel the strength leaking out with every heartbeat. The storm raged harder now, thunder rolling like cannon fire. The lamps flickered, casting wild shadows across the room. Luke crouched near the door, rain whipping through the cracks, and saw movement. Blake, crawling toward the porch with murder in his eyes. Luke steadied the rifle, took a slow breath, and squeezed the trigger. The shot ripped through the downpour. Blake stumbled, his hat spinning off into the mud. But when he looked up again, his grin was still there. Blood running down his face, but grin still there. "Too slow, Harrison," he shouted, ducking behind a post. Luke cursed under his breath. Then from the loft, another gunshot cracked. The post splintered and Blake dropped flat, mud splashing up around him. Naya's voice came steady, almost calm. "He's done." For a long moment, there was nothing but the rain. Then the remaining men, realizing their leader was down, began to retreat. Their shouts faded into the night, swallowed by thunder and distance. Luke lowered the rifle and slumped against the wall, breathing hard. The blood on his shoulder ran in thin streams down his arm, mingling with rainwater and grit. When Naya climbed down, the firelight showed her face streaked with soot and rain, eyes wide with both fear and fury. She knelt beside him, pressing her hands against the wound. "You're bleeding for me," she said quietly, almost accusingly. He met her gaze, half smiling through the pain. "Guess I'm too stubborn to quit." The storm raged for another hour, but the gunfire never came back. By the time the thunder rolled off toward the mountains, the world outside had turned to mud and ruin. The corral lay half collapsed, fence posts splintered and blackened. The wind carried the smell of gunpowder and wet wood. Inside, the cabin was half in shadow, half in smoke. Rain leaked through the bullet holes, sizzling where it met the embers of the dying fire. Nia wrapped Luke's shoulder with strips torn from an old sheet. Her hands were quick. Sure, the movements of someone who'd tended too many wounds in her life. He sat silent, watching her. Outside, the last of the storm faded into a tired drizzle. When she finished, she looked at him, the stubborn lines around his mouth, the pain hidden behind his eyes. "You should have let me fight them alone," she whispered. Luke shook his head. "That's not how I'm built." "Maybe that's what'll get you killed." "Maybe," he said, leaning back, a faint grin tugging at his lips. "But I reckon dying for the right thing beats living scared." She looked down at her hands, stained red with his blood. For a long moment, neither spoke. The fire popped once, throwing a final flash of light across the walls. Finally, Naya broke the silence. "They'll tell everyone in town now." "Let 'em," Luke said softly. "I ain't running." When the first pale light of dawn crept through the shattered window, the land outside looked washed clean, as if the storm had tried to erase what happened and failed. Luke stepped onto the porch, shoulder bound, movements stiff. The air was cool, damp, and heavy with silence. Nia followed behind him, barefoot, her coat too big for her frame. Together they looked out at the wreckage, the fence torn down, the barn scarred with bullet holes, the mud dark where blood had mixed with rain. "This place still yours?" she asked quietly. Luke nodded once. "Always will be." She studied him, the weary strength in his eyes, the way he stood straight despite the pain. For a heartbeat, the whole world seemed to hold still. And then, as if answering something unspoken, the wind shifted, carrying the smell of wet sage and iron away from the ranch. It left only peace, fragile, temporary, but peace all the same. Dawn broke over the valley like a slow breath. The storm had passed, leaving behind a quiet too deep to trust. The ground still steamed from the night's rain. The red dirt turned to dark clay beneath their boots. The air was heavy with the smell of gunpowder and wet sage. Luke Harrison stood by the fence line, his shirt torn and his shoulder wrapped in a rough bandage that had already spotted through with blood. The land around him looked like a battlefield. Fence posts shattered, the barn leaning, the earth littered with brass casings that caught the new sunlight like dull gold. Beside him, Nia knelt in the mud, her braid clinging to her back, her face calm but unreadable. She moved carefully, collecting spent shells in a small wooden box. When she reached the last of them, she paused, staring at the hole it had left in the soil. Dark, circular, and damp. Without a word, she dug her fingers into the earth and pressed a few kernels of corn into the wound. Luke frowned, leaning on the fence. "What are you doing?" She looked up, wiping mud from her cheek. "Planting life where blood was spilled." He blinked, unsure if he should answer. Finally, he just said, "That's a mighty tall hope for this land." She gave a small, quiet smile. Hope grows better in broken ground. For a while, they worked in silence. Luke fixed what he could of the fence, hammering new rails into place, while Naya planted her tiny patch beside the corral. The rhythm of it, wood against wood, shovel against soil, filled the morning like a hymn for the living. When the sun finally crested the hills, light poured across the ranch. The mud shimmered, the shadows thinned. Luke took a deep breath and felt something shift inside him, like the land itself was forgiving him for surviving. Over the next few days, the ranch found its rhythm again. The rain had softened the earth, and the air felt cleaner somehow, washed of gun smoke and fear. Luke spent his mornings repairing the barn roof, his arms stiff but healing. He worked slow, methodical, each nail a small promise that the world hadn't fallen apart for good. Inside the cabin, Naya boiled coffee, the smell drifting through the open door. She'd taken to humming while she worked, soft Apache melodies that blended with the creak of the floorboards and the whisper of the wind. Sometimes Luke caught himself listening. One afternoon, while he sat mending his saddle straps, Naya stepped outside with an old tattered book. "You said you could read," she said, holding it out. "Teach me." Luke looked up, surprised. "You sure?" She nodded. "If I'm to live among words I can't understand, I ought to learn them." He took the book, dusted it off, and flipped through the pages. "Bible," he muttered. "Only thing left worth reading out here." They sat by the porch steps, the late sun spilling across their faces. He read slowly, his voice deep and steady. She repeated the words, her accent turning them soft and strange, like something sacred. When she stumbled, he smiled, something rare and small that changed his whole face. "Grace," he said, "means being given more than you deserve." She looked at him for a long moment. "You've given me that already." Luke turned away, embarrassed, pretending to adjust the book. "Ain't sure I'd call it grace. Just seemed the right thing to do." "Right things don't come easy," she said. That night, the wind carried the smell of cedar smoke across the valley. The two of them sat by the fire inside, the warm light flickering over the scarred wood walls. Naya pointed to the cup by his hand. "What's the word for that again?" "Coffee." She nodded, repeating it. "Coffee." He chuckled. "Close enough." Then she pointed at herself. "Naya." He nodded. "I know that one." Her eyes narrowed playfully. "And you?" "Luke." "Means what?" He hesitated, then shrugged. "Don't rightly know. My ma just liked the sound of it." "In my tongue," she said softly, "we name for meaning. Naya means flower after rain." He smiled faintly. "Fittin', I'd say." She turned her gaze to the fire, her expression distant but peaceful. "Where I come from, we believe the land remembers. Every drop of blood, every tear. But sometimes if you plant right, it forgets." Luke watched her profile in the firelight, the calm strength, the quiet pain. "Then I hope it forgets this place," he murmured. The days stretched long and golden. The violence that had scarred their lives began to fade into routine. Work, quiet meals, the occasional laughter that felt too new to trust. Luke taught her how to mend a saddle, how to patch a roof. In return, she taught him Apache words for the things around him, the land, the wind, the stars. "Shash," she said one night, pointing at the horizon. "Bear." He repeated it, stumbling over the sound. She laughed, shaking her head. "You speak like a child." "Guess that makes you my teacher," he said. "Then you better listen." For the first time in years, Luke did. Far beyond the ranch, the land stretched into a wide scar of dry plains and low ridges. And somewhere out there, another man sat watching through a pair of brass binoculars. Blake Turner. He was perched on a rise of rock, his coat drawn tight against the wind. The wound on his arm had healed crooked, but the hate hadn't faded. He'd watched Luke's land from afar for 3 days, saw the smoke rise from the chimney, saw two figures moving together through the fields. He couldn't understand it. Luke Harrison, the man who once rode beside him, who'd fought and bled under the same flag, now living with the very kind of person they'd been told to wipe out. He spat into the dirt, shaking his head. "What the hell happened to you, Harrison?" he muttered. Through the binoculars, he saw them now. Luke and Naya standing side by side, working the earth. She laughed at something he said, brushing hair from her face. Luke's shoulders eased, and for a brief moment, he looked like a man at peace. The sight twisted something in Blake's gut. It wasn't just hate, it was confusion. Envy, a hollow ache he didn't have words for. He lowered the binoculars and rubbed his jaw. The land around him was dry and lifeless. No crops, no color, no laughter. Down below, on Luke's ranch, the light from the cabin window glowed steady and warm, flickering against the twilight like a lantern refusing to die. Blake turned away, but the image followed him. The woman's laughter, the rancher's stillness, the impossible notion that maybe the desert could bloom again. Back on the ranch, Naya stood on the porch as dusk settled over the land. The small corn shoots she'd planted had begun to break through the soil, tiny green blades reaching for the fading light. Luke came up beside her, wiping sweat from his neck. "They're growing," she nodded. "The earth remembers kindness too." He smiled, leaning on the post. "Guess it just needed reminding." They stood there a long time, the wind soft for once, the air sweet with rain and smoke. For the first time since the war, Luke didn't feel like a man waiting for something to take what he loved. The storm had come and gone, the world hadn't ended, and somewhere in that fragile silence between thunder and sunrise, something new had taken root, something that neither bullets nor hatred could kill. Summer came quietly, soft as a sigh. The storm's scars had healed into green, the cornfields stretching wide, swaying under the blue sweep of Arizona sky. The land smelled of life again, rain, soil, and sun-warmed wood. Luke Harrison stood at the fence line with his hands resting on the top rail, watching the crops move like waves. His shoulder had healed, though it still ached when it rained. Naya worked in the rows not far from him, her braid glinting like black silk in the light. They had built something here. Quiet, simple, fragile. No one said it aloud, but both knew peace in the West never lasted long. That morning, the peace broke. Luke saw them first, 5 riders coming slow along the ridge. The heat made their shapes shimmer, ghosts on horseback, moving with purpose. He stepped closer to the gate, hand hovering near his holster. As the riders approached, he caught sight of their faces. Bronze skin, long hair, beads and feathers fluttering in the wind. Apache. Naya saw them next. She froze, the bucket slipping from her hand, water spilling into the dirt. Her lips parted. "No!" The lead rider dismounted, an older man with streaks of gray in his braid and a necklace of bear claws around his neck. His eyes found hers and his face broke, half in disbelief, half in joy. "Naya!" he called out, voice trembling. She took a step forward, her hands shaking. "Uncle!" Then she was running. The old man caught her in his arms, clutching her as though the wind might steal her again. For a moment, the whole valley seemed to hold its breath. Luke turned away, giving them space. His chest felt tight, heavier than he'd expected. The reunion lasted until the sun began to dip. They spoke in Apache, words rolling fast, soft, broken by tears and laughter. Luke didn't understand the language, but he didn't have to. He could read every emotion in her face. When the old man finally turned to him, his expression changed. He studied Luke carefully, taking in the rifle near the porch, the bandaged shoulder, the quiet dignity in his stance. "You saved her," the man said in slow, accented English. Luke nodded once. "She did most of the saving herself." The man's mouth twitched, half a smile, half a warning. "You gave her shelter." "I gave her what anyone should." "No," the uncle said, shaking his head. "Not anyone. Not your kind." Pana, Luke didn't answer. The truth didn't need defending. The old man looked back toward the field, where Naya stood waiting, torn between two worlds. "She belongs with her people. It is time she comes home." Luke swallowed hard. "Maybe you're right." When the man rode off to make camp with the others, Naya came back slowly, eyes red but clear. Luke was still standing by the porch, the light catching the rough planes of his face. "They want me to go," she said quietly. "I figured." She hesitated. "He thought I was dead." "That makes 2 of us," Luke said, trying to smile. Naya's gaze dropped to the dirt between them. "You think I should go?" He looked at her then, really looked. The woman she'd become since that night in the storm. Strong, brave, free. "They're your people, Naya." His voice was low, steady. "You should be with them." She studied him, searching for something in his expression. "And you?" He turned toward the horizon, where the sun was sinking behind the hills. "I'll keep the land going. There's fences need fixing, and that corn don't tend itself." It wasn't much of an answer, but it was all he could say without his voice breaking. That night, the sky burned red with the setting sun. Nia packed in silence, her few clothes, a small pouch of seeds, the old book Luke had used to teach her English. Every sound of her folding and tying cut through the cabin like distant thunder. Luke sat by the fire, pretending to clean his revolver, though there wasn't a speck of dust on it. The flames painted his face in shifting golds and shadows. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft but certain. "He says the tribe will move north soon, near the San Carlos lands." "Good country," Luke said without looking up. "Cooler air, plenty of water." "Safer too," she added. He nodded. "Safer's good." Silence again. Then she said quietly, "You could come." The words hit him like a hammer. He froze, hands still on the revolver. "Don't think they'd take kindly to me, Naya." "You don't know that." "I do." He met her eyes, pain flickering there. "Some things are too far gone to fix." She swallowed hard. "Maybe not everything." He shook his head. "Go with them. You deserve a life that ain't built out of fighting and fences." Her lips trembled. "And what about you?" Luke gave a small, tired smile. "I've got what I need." "Do you?" she asked, almost a whisper. He didn't answer. He couldn't. When she finished packing, she stood by the door. Outside, the cicadas hummed. The night thick and warm. Her horse was already saddled, waiting in the soft glow of moonlight. Luke rose slowly, walking her to the threshold. "You'll find peace out there," he said. "You'll see the stars again, the way you remember them. And you?" He gave a faint chuckle. "Guess I'll just keep talking to the land till it talks back." She looked at him for a long moment, memorizing every line of his face, the scar near his temple, the rough stubble, the quiet sadness he tried to hide. Then she stepped closer, pressing her forehead to his chest. The smell of wood smoke and rain clung to him. "Thank you," she whispered. "For what?" "For not being like the rest of them." Luke's throat worked, but no words came. He rested his hand on the back of her head, holding her there a second longer than he should have. Then softly he let go. But when morning came, she was still there. The first light spilled across the fields, touching the corn leaves with gold. Luke opened the door, expecting emptiness, and instead found her standing in the yard, her pack still at her feet, staring toward the rows where the earth was dark and rich from the storm. He stepped out quietly. "You change your mind?" She didn't turn around. "I couldn't leave it." "The corn?" "No," she said softly. "The place that gave me back my breath." Luke frowned, unsure what she meant until she turned. Her eyes met his, steady, full of something he couldn't name but felt deep in his chest. "My home isn't where I was born, Luke." He swallowed. "Then where is it?" "Where I was cared for." The wind stirred between them, rustling through the green rose like the sound of a heartbeat. Luke exhaled slowly, all the fight draining out of him. He wanted to speak, to tell her she was free to stay, that he'd never ask for more than her company in this quiet patch of land. But the words felt too small, so instead, he just nodded, eyes bright in the morning sun. "Then I reckon you're home." Later that day, the Apache riders moved on without her. The old uncle gave Luke a long, knowing look before turning his horse north. As they disappeared into the heat shimmer, Naya stood beside Luke, watching until the last figure was gone. Neither spoke. The silence between them wasn't the kind that hurt anymore. It was the kind that held everything words couldn't say. When the wind shifted, carrying the scent of fresh corn and rain, Luke reached down, brushed a bit of dirt from her palm, and said quietly, "Let's get to work. The land don't wait." And together they walked toward the fields, two souls bound not by blood, but by choice. The year turned slow, as it always did out west. Rain came when it wanted to. The sun stayed longer than welcome. But through it all, the land endured, and so did they. 1 year after the storm, Luke Harrison's ranch no longer looked like a wound carved into the desert. The fences stood straight. The barn had been rebuilt from the ground up. And where blood once soaked the dirt, corn now grew high, green, strong, whispering under the warm breath of summer wind. The place had changed, and so had the man who owned it. Luke's hair had gone grayer at the temples. The limp in his walk had worsened since the night of the gunfight, but his eyes, those steady, sun-bleached eyes, had softened. Most mornings he'd wake before dawn, pour coffee, and step outside to listen. The sound of the windmill turning had become a kind of prayer, a slow, creaking rhythm that reminded him the land was still alive. And every morning, he'd find Naya already there, her hands deep in the soil, her shadow long against the rows of corn. They worked side by side in near silence, the way two people do when words aren't needed. Luke taught her how to mend the harness straps, how to tell when the well pump needed oil. Naya taught him when to plant and when to let the soil rest, how to listen for the tone of rain before it reached the valley. Once, as they walked the field, he said, "You ever think about what people say out there?" She looked up from her work, squinting against the sun. "What do they say?" He shrugged. "That we're a story now. Some say it's a lie. Others say it's a miracle." She smiled faintly. "Maybe both." Luke chuckled, running a thumb along the brim of his hat. Folks always did mix those two up. And for a long moment, the only sound was the wind, carrying with it the rustle of corn leaves, a sound like the earth breathing. By midsummer, the valley was heavy with life. Bees hummed along the wildflowers, and the riverbed, once dry as bone, held a thin line of moving water again. Naya had turned part of the field into a small garden. Beans, squash, peppers. She'd painted the porch with old ochre clay, leaving handprints that glowed red in the morning light. One evening, Luke stood at the edge of the porch, watching her tie bundles of corn husks together. "You make it look easy," he said. She smiled without looking up. "It's not, but it's honest work." "Can't argue with that." "Funny," she said softly. "A year ago, I didn't think I'd live long enough to be tired from working." Luke leaned against the post, his voice gentle. "And now you're the hardest worker on the ranch." She laughed, a low, warm sound that reached into the quiet. "That's not saying much, old man." He grinned, tipping his hat. "Fair enough." The town of Dry Hollow had stopped talking months ago. At first there were whispers about the rancher who'd taken in an Apache woman, about what it meant, what it said about right and wrong. But gossip, like wind, runs out of breath eventually. What lingered wasn't scorn, it was curiosity. People started sending supplies again. A blacksmith fixed Luke's plow for free. A widow from town brought sugar and coffee. And slowly the story of the ranch changed from a scandal to something softer, something people told their children when they wanted them to believe in goodness again. Then one morning, a shadow appeared on the horizon. Luke noticed first. He was mending the gate when he saw a rider cresting the far ridge. The figure came slow, not in anger, but with the weariness of a man who'd ridden a long way to make peace. As he drew near, Luke recognized the slouch of the shoulders, the broad hat, the dust of 1,000 miles on his coat. Blake Turner. Luke's hand brushed the butt of his revolver, then dropped away. He didn't need it, not anymore. Blake stopped at the fence, dismounted stiffly, and removed his hat. Time had carved him rough, his face leaner, his eyes older. The arrogance burned out like old whiskey. For a while, neither man spoke. The only sound was the creak of leather and the slow turn of the windmill blades. Finally, Blake said, "Heard you made something of this place." Luke nodded. "Trying to." Blake looked past him toward the cabin. Naya stood in the doorway, still as stone but unafraid. Their eyes met for just a second. No hate, no blame, only understanding. Blake turned back to Luke. "Didn't come to stir trouble." "Didn't think you did." Blake reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a small wooden plank. The words carved into it were rough but careful. "Forgive what the land remembers." He handed it over, his voice low. "Figured you'd know where it belongs." Luke studied the carving for a long time, tracing the grooves with his thumb. The message sat heavy between them. When he finally looked up, Blake was already turning to leave. "Blake," Luke called. The man stopped. "You ever find peace out there?" Blake gave a faint smile, tired but honest. "Still looking." Then he mounted his horse and rode off into the heat shimmer, a fading shape swallowed by the wide, forgiving land. Luke watched until the horizon took him. Then he turned and nailed the wooden plank onto the fence post by the gate. The words caught the sunlight, glowing faintly against the grain. That evening, the world settled into a quiet so deep it almost hurt. The air smelled of corn and summer dust. Crickets sang from the dry grass. The windmill turned slow and steady, whispering over the golden fields. Naya sat on the porch steps, her dress brushed with soil and pollen. Luke joined her, lowering himself carefully beside her, his knees popping in protest. They didn't speak for a while. They didn't need to. The kind of silence between them wasn't emptiness. It was full of everything they'd survived. As the sun began to sink behind the red mountains, Nia rested her head on his shoulder. The sky burned orange, then gold, then deep purple. The wind carried the smell of rain from far away, as if the land itself exhaled after holding its breath for too long. Luke's voice came soft. "You think peace lasts?" She smiled against his sleeve, her tone calm and sure. "Only if we keep planting it." He looked down at her, a hint of a grin tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Then I reckon we've got work to do." Nia nodded. "Always." They sat that way until the light faded, until the horizon swallowed the last streaks of gold, and the desert turned the color of dusk. Somewhere far off, a lone coyote called, mournful, distant, alive. Luke reached for her hand, calloused fingers brushing against hers. She didn't pull away. Their joined hands rested on the porch rail, as steady as the land beneath them. As night fell, the camera of the mine pulls back. The ranch glows soft under the fading sky, the fields heavy with corn, the wooden fence standing tall, the sign catching the last light of day. Forgive what the land remembers. Beyond it, the desert stretches endlessly, harsh, beautiful, and eternal. The wind moves through the valley like a whisper, rustling through the crops, carrying with it the sound of life rebuilt from ruin. And on the porch, two figures remain, small against the vastness, their silhouettes bathed in the final amber light of the dying sun. Luke Harrison, the quiet rancher who chose mercy over pride. Nia, the Apache woman who taught the land to breathe again. Together they are what the frontier rarely gave, a second chance. The camera drifts higher, the ranch shrinking into the red and gold of the western horizon. The last line of sun glints off the windmill, turning slow and sure. Then darkness, warm and endless, and with it, the quiet truth of every Western worth remembering, that even the hardest land can forgive, and even the most wounded hearts can bloom again.